She came to court to support her cousin, quiet, respectful, unseen. But when a judge fined her for a small cross necklace, she stood up, and the entire courtroom fell silent. What followed wasn't a shouting match. It was something more powerful. Truth, calmly delivered by a woman who knew the law and her worth. From dismissal to policy change, this is the true story of how one voice, firm, composed, and unwavering, changed everything. This is the woman who changed the room. Chanel Whitaker didn't come to the courthouse to be noticed. She came to be present. The sky over Rockdale County was an indifferent gray that morning, the kind that didn't promise anything, sun, rain, or mercy. Chanel had taken the morning off work, driven an hour through traffic, and slipped quietly into the back of courtroom 2B just as the bailiff was calling it to order. Her cousin, 22-year-old Marcus Bradley, was being arraigned for a low-level misdemeanor after a traffic stop spiraled out of control. She wasn't here to argue law or raise eyebrows. She was just here for family. Her outfit was respectful but simple. A gray cardigan over a navy blouse, black slacks, low flats. No jewelry except a slim gold chain from which hung a delicate cross no bigger than a dime. She wore it every day. It was her grandmother's, given to her with the words, "For when you feel small in rooms full of power." Chanel sat in the second row, quiet, still, her bag folded in her lap, her posture straight. Marcus caught her eye once, offered a nervous half-smile. She nodded gently. That was all he needed. That was all she had to give. And then the judge walked in. Judge Edmund Baylor had presided over Rockdale County for 20 years. He was a Vietnam veteran, a traditionalist by his own description, and known in legal circles for being firm but fair. Though the black and brown defendants who appeared before him often found only the first half of that equation. He took the bench with the stiff posture of someone always being watched. His gavel knocked once, the room hushed. Then he did something no one expected. He looked past the defense table, past the state's attorney, and pointed directly at Chanel. "You, ma'am." In the gray cardigan, his voice echoed. "Please rise." Chanel blinked, surprised. She rose slowly. Judge Baylor's face was flat, emotionless. "You are in violation of this courtroom's dress code. Religious symbols are not permitted. That cross necklace violates the standard of neutrality. You are fined $50. The room froze. People shifted in their seats. Marcus's face dropped. Chanel remained standing. "Excuse me, Your Honor," she said calmly. "Is there a published court policy banning jewelry like this? This is my courtroom." Judge Baylor snapped. "And in my courtroom, we maintain neutrality. You can pay the fine or leave." Chanel didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. "I'm here in support of my cousin. I won't leave. And I'd like to see the specific statute or local court rule that prohibits this necklace." The temperature in the room shifted. A few people exchanged glances. The prosecutor's pen stopped moving. The bailiff looked sideways at the bench. Judge Baylor narrowed his eyes. "You're challenging my authority?" Chanel didn't flinch. "I'm asking for clarity under the law." The pause that followed was so thick you could hear someone cough 3 rows back. "Ma'am, you are not counsel. You're a spectator. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Chanel breathed through her nose. One slow inhale. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "my name is Chanel Whitaker. I'm a constitutional attorney, admitted to the bar in Georgia, New York, and D.C. I specialize in First and Fourth Amendment law. If you'd like, I have my bar card with me." The entire room shifted. Whispers began to ripple like water down the gallery. One woman behind her mouthed, "What?" Chanel wasn't finished. "I'm not here to challenge the court. I'm here to support my cousin. But I also know that a fine issued without precedent or posted policy raises serious constitutional questions." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was curious, listening, and the judge, stoic, composed, powerful, hesitated. For the first time all morning, he hesitated. Chanel hadn't planned on revealing who she was. That wasn't the kind of power she enjoyed wielding. But in that moment, with the courtroom holding its breath and a judge trying to shrink her presence to a fine and a scolding, she knew it wasn't about pride. It was about memory. She had been here before. Not this exact courtroom, not this exact judge, but this moment. The moment where a black woman's presence alone felt like a disruption. And she'd been trained for it, first by life, then by law. Born and raised in the south side of Birmingham, Alabama, Chanel grew up in a duplex that creaked with every season change. Her mother worked doubles at a dialysis center. Her father disappeared when she was 5. Chanel didn't grow up with much, but she had one priceless inheritance: the ability to sit still in the face of insult and stand up in the face of injustice. At 12, she memorized the preamble to the Constitution, not for a school project, but because she'd seen a boy her age get handcuffed outside their neighborhood laundromat for sitting too long. She'd asked her mother why, and her mother had said softly, "Baby, some rules were never written for us." That stayed with her. By 16, Chanel was winning citywide debate competitions. By 22, she had graduated from Howard University with honors. At 26, she became one of the youngest public defenders in Fulton County. And all the while, through college exams, bar prep, late nights in holding cells trying to get teenage boys released before their futures were erased, she wore that cross. It had belonged to her grandmother, Chanel Whitaker, who'd marched in Birmingham with King and cleaned houses 6 days a week for white families who never remembered her name. Lucille gave Chanel that necklace the night before her LSAT. "I wore this when they called me gal and told me I didn't belong," Lucille had whispered. "Wear it when you walk into rooms they think you shouldn't be in. Just don't take it off, not for them." So no, Chanel wasn't going to apologize for a necklace, not today. Back in the courtroom, the temperature had changed. The room that once saw her as background noise now saw her with new eyes. Not a woman in violation, a woman in command. The judge didn't respond right away. His fingers tapped on the bench, uncertain. "I have no intention of disrupting proceedings," Chanel continued evenly. "But I'd like this matter of the fine to be recorded properly and not brushed aside without citation." Judge Baylor cleared his throat. "We'll return to that after the current case." Chanel nodded once and sat. The quiet in the courtroom wasn't awkward now, it was watchful. Eyes that once ignored her now followed her every move. And they weren't the only ones. Marcus glanced at her from the defense table, his posture a little straighter now. She gave him a look, subtle, grounding. "I'm here. I've got you." As the next case began, whispers stirred again. Not gossip, respect, curiosity. In the gallery behind her, an older woman in a church hat leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "Did she say constitutional attorney?" Meanwhile, Chanel sat still, calm but never small. This wasn't about showing off. This wasn't about ego. It was about presence. And, sharpened by every courtroom she'd walked into where she'd been called Miss, not counselor. Every time she was mistaken for the assistant or the clerk. Every time someone told her she didn't look like a lawyer. Well, this is what a lawyer looked like today. And she was just getting started. When Marcus's name was finally called, the courtroom shifted again. Not just in posture, but in energy. Chanel stood before the defense table, crisp and focused, while the public defender looked uncertain about whether to move forward. "Your Honor," Chanel said, stepping forward. "With the court's permission, I would like to represent Mr. Marcus Reed for this hearing. I have reviewed the charges and spoken with him prior to the session." Judge Baylor stared at her for a second. The same judge who had fined her earlier now had to decide whether to let her speak. His fingers curled slightly around his gavel. "You're not listed as counsel of record," he said, trying to maintain control. "I have my Tennessee bar card with me," she replied, offering it. "My license is current and in good standing. You may verify it with the Board of Professional Responsibility under Chanel Whitaker." The name hung in the air. More whispers. One man in the second row leaned to his wife and muttered, "I've read about her. She got that housing discrimination case overturned in Memphis last year." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed." Chanel nodded once in return and turned to Marcus, who looked like he was trying not to cry. She placed her hand briefly on his shoulder, reassurance, not theatrics, and then faced the courtroom. "Mr. Reed was pulled over for a non-functioning taillight," she began, her voice calm, clear, practiced. "According to the officer's arrest report, he was asked to exit the vehicle and was subsequently searched. There is no mention of probable cause, no warrant, no record of prior consent." She raised a folded document from her bag and handed it to the clerk. "I've submitted a motion to dismiss the charge of resisting arrest on the grounds that the stop and subsequent search were in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Additionally, the resisting charge is unsupported by any video evidence, despite officers being equipped with body-worn cameras." Judge Baylor blinked. So did the prosecutor. Chanel continued, "The department policy clearly states that all searches and arrests must be documented. The absence of footage raises questions. Mr. Reed's only resistance was asking why he was being detained." Baylor leaned back, reviewing the motion now in his hand. You could hear the paper crinkle as he scanned the text. His lips moved slightly, his expression clouding with every paragraph. He adjusted his glasses once, then again. Behind Chanel, the gallery leaned forward. The tone in the room was no longer skepticism. It was awe. One by one, people who had come just to kill time or pay fines were realizing they were watching something rare, a courtroom being recalibrated in real time. Baylor set the motion down and glanced at the prosecutor. "State's position?" The prosecutor cleared his throat. "We're willing to drop the resisting charge and keep the traffic infraction." Chanel's gaze didn't flinch. "We'll accept that, Your Honor, only if the court acknowledges that the search was unconstitutional and that Mr. Reed was not in violation of any lawful command." Bold, clean, legal. There was a pause, long enough to feel permanent. Finally, Judge Baylor sighed, almost as if the weight of the moment pressed against him physically. "Motion to dismiss granted," he said. "Resisting arrest charge is dropped. Traffic violation stands as a warning. No fine." A few murmurs of "damn" and "wow" rippled through the back rows. Chanel turned to Marcus. "You're free to go." He didn't move at first. It was like his brain needed a second to catch up with his body. Then he stood, slowly, before pulling her into a tight, shaking hug. Chanel didn't smile. This wasn't about celebration. This was about justice, delivered with no theatrics, only truth. She turned back toward the bench, composed, and said evenly, "Before I return to my seat, Your Honor, I'd like to formally challenge the fine issued to me earlier this morning." You could hear a pin drop. Everyone in the courtroom froze, even Baylor. She was just getting started. Judge Baylor sat back, eyes narrowing slightly. His fingers tapped once, twice on the bench. His gavel sat still. "You're challenging the fine?" Chanel stood calmly, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shift her weight. But her presence filled the space. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, respectfully. "I'm asking for the court to clarify the basis of that penalty and to consider withdrawing it based on constitutional protections." "Are you accusing this court of violating your rights?" he asked. "I'm stating facts. You issued a fine for wearing a cross necklace, an item of personal religious significance, without referencing any posted policy, courtroom guideline, or applicable statute." She took a single step forward. In County of Allegheny v. ACLU, the Supreme Court held that government institutions must remain neutral, not hostile toward religion. Prohibiting a small cross worn under clothing on no other basis than appearance moves beyond neutrality. It becomes suppression. The judge shifted in his seat. For the first time all morning, he looked less like a man in power and more like a man who had lost the narrative without realizing it. A young law clerk sitting in the corner stared wide-eyed. The bailiff's hands, once clasped casually in front of him, now rested more formally at his sides. Chanel continued, never once raising her voice. Furthermore, there were no signs posted stating such a restriction. I wasn't testifying. I wasn't addressing the court. I was sitting silently to support a defendant, my cousin. And I wore a cross that has been passed down through 3 generations of my family. She paused. Just a breath. Just enough for every word to land. There was no legal justification for the fine, and no attempt to verify who I was before issuing it. The entire room held its breath. Even Baylor seemed to struggle for a reply. His gaze shifted downward, reviewing something invisible on the desk. His voice, when it came, was quieter. I see your point. Chanel didn't move, she didn't press, and maybe that was what made it land harder than anything else. No gloating, no grandstanding, just clarity and a sense of rightness that felt older than the court itself. The fine is withdrawn, Baylor said after a long silence. It will not appear on the court record. There was no applause, but there was a ripple of something more powerful than sound. A shift. Chanel bowed her head slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. She returned to her seat in the gallery. The air felt different, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. People around her were whispering now, but not with confusion, with curiosity. Respect. Who is she? Someone asked softly behind her. She didn't even yell, and he backed down. In the front row, the bailiff leaned slightly toward the prosecutor and murmured something. The prosecutor nodded, eyes still fixed on Chanel. Court resumed, but the rhythm was off. Cases were called. Pleas were entered. But everyone's eyes kept drifting back to her. To the woman who stood without raising her voice. To the woman who walked into a courtroom not to make noise, but to shift its center of gravity. 30 minutes later, Judge Baylor unexpectedly called for a short recess. He didn't say why, just stood and exited through the side door. As people filed out for a break, the bailiff approached Chanel, no longer stern, no longer wary. Ma'am, he said, his voice lowered. I've worked here 8 years. I've never seen him do that. Not once. Chanel gave a gentle, tired smile. He's not a bad man, she said softly, but power without accountability? That's dangerous. The bailiff nodded. Not because he had to, because he understood. Outside, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky. But inside that courtroom, something had just been raised. Something that would not be forgotten. Not by Judge Baylor, not by the people watching, and not by Chanel Whitaker. Court resumed. Cases were heard, files shuffled. But something in the room remained altered. Judge Baylor spoke more slowly now, less clipped, less commanding, as if each decision he made had begun to weigh differently in his hands. Chanel sat in silence, the cross necklace still resting against her blouse. She didn't watch him to make sure he behaved differently. She knew the moment had already planted itself. A seed doesn't need to be stared at to grow. By the end of the session, when Deshawn turned to her outside the courthouse, his expression was part awe, part disbelief. You didn't just help me, he said. You made him flinch. He paused. You changed something. Chanel shook her head gently. No, I reminded him of what was already true. They walked toward the parking lot, and Deshawn's phone buzzed. A text from a friend, then another, then a screenshot. A local blog had already posted an article with the headline, Attorney Defends Faith and Family in Rutherford County Courtroom. Judge withdraws controversial fine. The image was grainy, taken from inside the courtroom. Chanel standing straight, chin high, calm like still water. Deshawn grinned. You're famous now. Chanel rolled her eyes. It'll pass, it always does. But it didn't. By the time she got home to her modest Memphis apartment, her inbox was swelling. Emails from former law professors, colleagues from the nonprofit, 3 strangers from different parts of the country, all women, thanking her for saying what they'd always wanted to say, but never had the words for. That night, Chanel sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, the cross necklace still around her neck, her grandmother's old Bible resting open beside her. She wasn't glowing with pride, she wasn't scrolling for likes, she was quiet, reflective. She knew this wasn't the climax. It was another mile marker in a journey most people never get to see. 2 days later, an envelope appeared taped to her office door. No return address, just her name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a short note. Miss Whitaker, I've revised the courtroom conduct guidelines. Religious attire or symbols, unless disruptive, will no longer be penalized. Just initials, no apology, no grand statement. But Chanel didn't need fireworks. She folded the note and tucked it into the back of her grandmother's Bible, between pages worn from years of midnight prayers. Weeks passed. Then a call came. Middle Tennessee State University's law department. They'd heard about what happened in Rutherford County. A faculty member forwarded the footage. Would Chanel consider speaking at a community forum about courtroom equity and civil liberties? She almost declined. But then she remembered the courtroom gallery, the people watching, the whispers that turned into curiosity, the way the bailiff's posture changed, the clerk's wide eyes, the way Deshawn walked taller afterward. She said yes, and once the first yes came, others followed. A church in Smyrna invited her to talk to their youth group about the Constitution and their rights. A women's shelter in Nashville asked if she could train staff to advocate better for residents during court hearings. Every time she stood before a group, someone would raise their hand and ask, "Weren't you that woman who shut down a judge?" And Chanel would smile. Not smug, just steady. "No," she'd say. "I was the woman who reminded him the law doesn't belong to just him." 6 months later, she returned to Rutherford County. Not as a cousin in the gallery, but as the keynote speaker for a courthouse symposium on judicial bias and procedural transparency. She wore the same necklace. No one said a word about it. Judge Baylor was there. He didn't avoid her. In fact, he sought her out. His handshake was firm, his expression more human. "I remember everything you said," he told her. "I hope so," she replied. There was no animosity, no need for it. Growth is quieter than guilt. One Friday afternoon, Chanel stopped by her nonprofit's Memphis office and found a group of summer interns huddled around the break room TV. They were watching a video, a re-uploaded clip from that courtroom moment. Someone had added text, "This is how you change the room without ever shouting." One of the interns turned to her, eyes bright. "I didn't even know that was you." Chanel just smiled and poured herself a cup of coffee. "It's not about being seen," she said. "It's about what you do when they finally see you." A year later, while speaking at a high school civics class in North Memphis, a girl named Jabria raised her hand. "You made a judge back down without yelling at him," she said. "How?" Chanel paused. She looked around at the classroom of wide eyes, skeptical faces, and hidden stories behind every stare. She stepped closer. "I didn't talk back," she said. "I talked forward." The girl frowned. "Aren't those the same thing?" "Not even close." Legacy doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears flats and a navy blue blouse. Sometimes it carries a worn leather purse and a cross passed down from a grandmother who prayed quietly. Sometimes it walks into a courtroom, gets fined for existing, and changes the rules without ever raising its voice. What is the lesson of this story? 1. Silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. You don't have to shout to make change. The calmest voice in the room can be the most powerful one. 2. Authority is not always right, and respect must be earned, not demanded. Questioning injustice isn't disrespect, it's courage. You have the right to ask why, especially when dignity is on the line. 3. Your story, your presence, and your truth matter, even when others try to ignore them. Just by standing firm, you show others they can too. Don't let anyone shrink your worth for their comfort. 4. Legacy isn't built in moments of ease. It's forged when someone chooses to stand. Like Chanel, your calm defiance today could become someone else's permission tomorrow. What do you think about this story? Let's comment below to discuss. And don't forget to subscribe our channel to listen to more interesting stories.